Hi guys! Thank you for joining me in my mini-series, A Journey into Tea, where we're going to be talking about the basics of brewing tea, hot versus cold, what is really tea leaf versus herbal tea or a tisane. I'm going to be talking about a few of my different herbal allies that I like to work with and how they help support the body through the use of tea. We're also going to go into how to create your own tea ceremony at home and how to make it part of your daily ritual and why it's important. And then at the very end, you'll get some recipe cards that you can take with you, print them out, make them at home, and let me know what you think. Cool, guys. So we're going to get started here today. I just wanted to go into a little bit about why we brew tea and why I love tea so much. So tea is super easy. People make it a little bit more complicated, I think, than it has to be. It's also full of health benefits. You can use it in ritual and meditation, or you can just use it as a delicious alternative beverage. And when you combine all of these things that we're going to talk about here today, not only is tea just going to be a drink in your life, but it can also become a new hobby. There's so many different things that you can do with it and really get lost in the world of tea. So that's what I'm hoping to do here, is inspire people to just get a little more lost on a journey in tea. So in the beginning, the basics of tea. So you guys might hear people talk about tea. You might hear people talk about herbal tea, tea leaves, tisanes, all sorts of different words that we use that kind of mean the same thing or mean different things, which can be confusing. So I wanted to start out by saying tea is used as a general word for a beverage made by steeping plant material in water. So pretty easy definition there of the actual beverage that is tea. So where some people don't realize there's a difference is when we talk about tea or tea leaf versus herbal tea or a tisane. So the tea leaf or the tea plant is actually known as Camellia sinensis, and that's where all of our white, green, oolong, black, pu'er, red tea, you name it, all of those different types of tea leaf actually all come from the same plant. And what creates the differences is how we dry and process those plants, which I'll get into a little bit later. But for now, what I want you to know is that the tea plant, tea leaf itself, comes from Camellia sinensis. And then on the other hand, we have herbal teas. Herbal teas, also known as tisanes, are infusions of herbs, roots, flowers, fruits, whatever else that you can find out in nature, and boiled in water to create tea. So there's no actual tea leaf, no Camellia sinensis in herbal teas, typically, unless you're blending herbs with tea. That's where it gets confusing, which is what I do. Don't worry about it. There's also not usually caffeine in your herbal teas, with the exception of things like mate, cacao, and a few other plants that can actually be stimulant but are not tea leaf or Camellia sinensis. Okay, so Camellia sinensis is the tea plant, and then we have herbal teas, also known as tisanes. I wanted to go into a little bit of the difference between tea bags and loose leaf tea. So there's a pretty big debate in the tea world about what's better, tea bags or loose leaf tea. But I think anybody who like really deep in the tea world would tell you that there's not really much of a debate because loose leaf tea is just for the win. Tea bags, there are a couple upsides to them. They are pretty convenient. I definitely agree with that. It's nice and easy. I'm honestly drinking a tea bag right now, so I get the convenience side of it. There's also usually a much cheaper price point on tea bags, so they're a little bit more accessible to some people. But there is a lot of downsides to using tea bags. So if you don't know this, a lot of the big names in tea bag companies, their tea bags are actually what we call tea dust. So it's the sweepings from the tea factories. So these big tea plants, all their little leftover crushed up bits, they actually take and sell to larger named companies. And then they resell those as tea bags. So yucky. Along with that, you just find a lot of other unknown ingredients in your tea bags. They're not usually listing out all of the different, preservatives, artificial flavors. There's all sorts of things that you're going to find in tea bags that aren't usually on the label, because not only what's in the tea bag, but the actual tea bag itself. A lot of times those are bleached or they're made of other like plastic materials. Like you'll see those little fancy like the triangle shaped tea bags. Those are usually made of like a weird plastic mesh, so you don't really know what you're steeping in your hot boiling water. You don't really want plastic in there. And also with tea bags, you typically have a lot less room for infusion. So even if you're avoiding, the dusty tea companies or the yucky tea bags, even if you're taking your own loose leaf tea and you're putting it into an actual tea bag to infuse, which I do sometimes, you're actually still losing, you're potentially losing a lot of flavor. You're losing a lot of benefit from the herb because it's not able to really open. It's not able to release all of its flavors to the fullest effect when it's crammed into that little tea bag. So those are just a couple things to keep in mind. If you prefer to use tea bags, again, I totally get it. I do it every once in a while. But if you are not familiar with loose leaf tea, that is where you should take the next step because loose leaf tea is so much more fun. The only real downside I see to loose leaf tea is that it typically takes just a touch more know-how. You just kind of want to know a couple basics, but that's why you're here. I'm going to go into those basic things in our mini series, and then hopefully there will be no more downsides to loose leaf tea for you, because the good sides of loose leaf tea, there's so many. Typically with loose leaf tea, you have much more transparent ingredients. You're going to know all of the different flavors that are in your tea, all the plants they come from. You will still find artificial flavoring sometimes, or even natural flavoring added to these teas. It's just kind of up to your preference if you want to avoid those or not, but at least you know what's in them. Loose leaf tea typically is going to have more health benefits as well because you're getting full bits of these plant materials. They're not ground down, they're not dried up. And on top of that, for the same reason, you're going to get better flavor as well. Because again, you have these whole bits. They're usually a little bit more on the fresh side. Yeah. And loose leaf tea is just all around more fun, in my opinion. You get to mix your own blends if you want. You can combine different herbs and teas together to make your own. Once you start really getting into it, you can get yourself tea sets and fancy infusers, and you just get to see all of these beautiful leaves and these beautiful plants and flowers come together to make such a delicious cup. And there's so much fun to be had in loose leaf tea. Okay, so included in your email, there should be a copy of this hot brew guide, as well as on the next page, we have our cold brew guide. So I'm just going to go over this really quick because you'll have it at home to kind of as a resource to go back to. So when you're hot brewing tea, it's pretty simple. There's really three main things that you want to pay attention to when you have loose leaf tea. So the first thing is the amount of tea that you're using. So a good rule of thumb is 1 teaspoon per 8-ounce cup. So your average cup is probably closer to about 8 to 10 ounces, I would say. It depends on how large of a mug you use, but as, again, a rule of thumb, 1 teaspoon per 8-ounce cup. So you can either go a little bit up, a little bit lower, whatever floats your boat. And it's also totally up to you and your flavor profile preferences. If you like something a little stronger, obviously you add more tea. It's up to you. But when it comes to actual tea leaf, a lot of times if we over add tea or even some herbal teas, you're going to get a really bitter or pungent flavor, which is why you want to keep that rule of thumb, 1 teaspoon per 8-ounce cup. Or if it's an herbal tea, 2 teaspoons for more flavor. Again, it's up to you. 1 to 2 teaspoons. On most of my bags, on the labels, I have 1 to 2 teaspoons. It's really a flavor preference thing. The second thing you want to pay attention to is the temperature of your water. So especially when it comes to actual tea leaf. So when we're talking about our whites, greens, oolongs, etc., you want to really pay attention to your water temperature because you can actually burn your tea leaf if it's too hot. So if you have an electric kettle or just a kettle on the stove, it's going to usually come all the way up to your boil before you just go pouring that boiling, scalding water onto your delicate tea leaf. I recommend letting your tea leaf or your water, cool for a few seconds to a minute or so before you pour it over. This way it's not so hot, it's not so aggressive on your tea leaf. That's going to cause a lot of bitter flavor. It can also cause bitter in certain floral herbs like chamomile or blue lotus, for example. So your more delicate leaves are your whites, your greens, your mild oolongs, even really, I would say any oolong, honestly. Black teas are a little less picky, but I really, for all tea leaf, I like to let that water cool at least for a couple seconds before I pour it over. Um, when it comes to most herbal teas, with the exception of those couple of florals, really you can pour your water on, boil it up, pour it over. It doesn't matter. They're a lot less picky. They're also a lot less picky about how long you steep them. Herbal teas are pretty easy. They're not finicky. Your tea leaf is where you have to pay a little bit more attention when it comes to brewing. And the third thing you want to pay attention to is the time you're brewing for. So with tea leaf, again, you want to be a little bit more specific. Herbal teas, it's a little bit looser rules. Your whites and greens are typically your most sensitive tea leaves, so I would only steep those for about 2 minutes. Oolongs are 3-minute steep time. Black tea, depending on the tea, 3 to 5 minutes. And again, your herbals are really not picky, so I would say at least 10 minutes, 10 to 15. Sometimes if you're doing like roots and stuff that's a little bit harder to penetrate, you can even go 20 minutes. Leave it as long as you want. It'll just get more and more strong. If you over steep your tea leaves, again, you can get more of that like bitter, like burnt bitter flavor from your tea leaf. So it's pretty simple. I know sometimes it can seem like a lot, but once you start to get it down, it's not that hard. You just, remember to only put about a teaspoon per cup. Don't put scalding hot water on your tea, and don't over steep your tea leaf. Cool. Cold brewing. So cold brewing is also a pretty simple process once you understand it. There's 2 different main methods of how you can make iced tea or cold brewed tea. The first method being instant iced tea. So like actual iced tea versus a cold brewed tea would be this. So iced tea, we want to use double the amount of tea leaf that we would normally use when we're hot steeping. So again, you're going to take double the amount of tea leaf, so 2 teaspoons per cup. And then you're going to steep it in your hot water according to the brewing directions for whatever tea leaf you're steeping. And then once you're brewed, you're going to strain it and pour it over ice. So you're basically just brewing like a double concentrate and then pouring it over ice, and the ice will water it down to the perfect flavor level. So it's really easy. Double the tea leaf, brew it like normal, and pour it over ice. Your other option is to cold brew or sun brew your tea. And for this method, you're going to use the same ratios or quantities of tea leaf to water that you would use in a hot brew. So you're 1-to-1 basically. And then you want to just let it sit. Let it sit in the sun. You can let it sit in the refrigerator. Depending on how hot it is, like if you're in peak summer, if you leave it in the sun, you'll get a faster steep as opposed to like sticking it in the refrigerator. But if you put it in the refrigerator, I usually say overnight is a great rule, and then you'll have a nice pitcher of iced tea for the next day. All right. So for this slide, I just kind of want to touch on it really quick because this is going a little bit deeper into brewing and herbalism in itself. But just to touch on it, we have a little bit of like a hot versus cold brew guide. So some herbs actually will release different constituents when they're cold versus hot water. So mucilaginous herbs, marshmallow root being the perfect example. Marshmallow root, when you pour hot water over it and steep it as a hot infusion, you will get health benefits out of it. You'll get some of the nutrients from it. But when you cold brew it or leave it in a cold pitcher in the fridge overnight, the next day you'll actually have more of like a viscousy tea. I don't like to say like mucusy, but a little mucusy. It's like it makes a thicker concoction. It's fun. Try it. There's some other ones that are better cold brewed, or not better, but just release different constituents. So that would be like your delicate florals. You'll get a really nice flavor from chamomile. Rose has a really nice flavor when you cold brew it. Nettle releases some different nutrients, as well as peppermint. So you can just kind of play around. Hot ones, you always want to do your roots hot. Basically, your roots and your barks are almost always going to want to be hot brewed. If you put them in cold water, they're not going to do a whole lot. Like licorice root, for example, burdock, dandelion, those guys aren't going to do much in a cold brew. So you can just boil the crap out of those and they'll be happy. All right, and our last slide for this part of the mini series just says that tea is simple or in depth. Tea is as simple or in depth as you choose to create it. So like I kind of mentioned in the beginning, I think some people can tend to overcomplicate tea. Hopefully I didn't overcomplicate it here for you. I'm trying to inspire you to just dive a little bit deeper. Once you start learning about the different things that you need to pay attention to and just little tidbits and fun facts, it really becomes a lot of fun, and it can be a simple process. It's whatever you make it.